Yeah, welcome to the talk, guys. Thanks for joining us. It's we've been on and off a little bit over the COVID period during just because things have been a bit hectic, as I'm sure they have been with everybody, and also with the cold and everything that's just been going on in South Africa. So, from wherever you guys are, welcome tonight, and just giving a couple more minutes for the rest of the people to kind of join us. Tonight's topic is pretty cool. It's about bee season and getting ready for the bee season. And guys, thanks for joining us. My name is Warwick. I'm Beware founder. Been in beekeeping for about 17 years. Been awesome to have you guys on board. And we generally do these talks on a Wednesday evening, except for the last one of the month, just due to business commitments. And it's great to have you guys on board. So we're talking about bees, right? So a lot of questions come up every year and at every one of our courses, considering starting with bees and bee season. So effectively, bee season actually starts in August. The first week of August, we like to start doing our prepping. So if you haven't already done fire breakers, you should have done fire clearing and fire breakers anyway during sort of Mayish. But just in case, because everything's really super dry at the time in August, it'll probably be a good idea to do it now again if you haven't already, and to repeat it again if you did it in end of May, beginning of June. So that's number one thing. Second thing that's important right now is feeding your bees. So if we talk a little bit about that, because a lot of people kind of like, well, why are we feeding bees? Why do we do that? It's a great question. Okay, the main reason is that currently, especially this winter, seems to have been, and you guys can hear me, right? Just to double check, anybody put up your hand, let me know that you guys can hear me, or put it in the chat. I'm coming through clearly. Yeah, cool. Thank you very much, Tanya. And welcome to the group. It's nice to have you guys on board. So why do we feed the bees? So essentially what ends up happening, guys, is that if we not only has it been cold, like super cold across South Africa at this time of year, there's also been a sort of a flux in the amount of food available for them, and they're under a lot more pressure in terms of urbanization of their foraging space. Also, the pesticides are fairly rampant in the moment, especially in the commercial as well as home use, unfortunately. Although I think there's a trend that seems to be trying to move away, especially in our group, between the beekeeping group and the homesteading group. A move to more greener type of pesticides and insecticides, which is awesome. But as far as commercial pesticides and that sort of thing go, bees, all kinds of pollinators are being affected by that. So it also affects their gut health. It affects them making it through the winter, keeping warm, etc., etc. So generally speaking, we feed the bees now so that they can make it through the winter if they haven't got enough stores to do that, especially because it's been so cold. And then secondly, and there's two different types of feeding for that matter. One is to actually help them get through the winter. So you're going to feed them a 2-to-1 ratio to sustain the bees, and then you're going to feed them a 1-to-1 sugar to water ratio. And this is white sugar, by the way. Don't use brown. White sugar 1-to-1 with water, and a teaspoon of vinegar just to keep it from fermenting. Okay. And once you've done that, you're going to feed them. Generally, you could, depending again on the size of the colony, but you could feed them. You could get away with feeding about a half a liter a day, even. And I think that probably would just help them to survive. It wouldn't be enough to warrant them creating excess honey and turning that sugar or syrup into a excess honey. But I also wouldn't feed them for longer than 7 days in consecutive time frame. So feed them for up to 7 days if you like, if you think that's necessary, especially during a cold front or black frost, both. And then give them a break. Give it a 2 or 3 day break, and then you can feed them again. This is just to give their guts a little bit of a break from the glucose sugar base, because usually their fructose and sucrose based diet is from nectar, right? Anyway, so So you want to feed them now. We want to feed. Why do we want to feed them? So we want to feed them now so that we can boost the queen laying instinct. Okay. So what happens when we do that? When we feed a one-to-one solution, we're going to boost the queen laying instinct and speed it up so that we're going to bring it fast forward now, in that she's been probably laying around 200 to 300 eggs only a day at the moment, just to sustain the colony over the last 2 to 3 months during the winter period. So by feeding a one-to-one solution at the moment, and you can use, how do we do that? So you can use entrance feeders. We have those at the shop in Centurion. We can ship across country. You can also use what we call internal feeder frames, which is kind of like a bucket, a frame, a container that takes up the space of a frame inside the hive. So you'd remove a brood frame from your brood box. You'd fill up this brood frame, which is basically a plastic frame container that fits inside between the rest of the frames. Fill it up with a sugar water that's usually ribbed on around on the inside of the container, and that will allow the bees to feed internally, which is pretty cool. They don't even have to leave the hive, especially if they can't leave the hive. At least they've got food sources right then and there. And an entrance feeder is similar. It's going to be something that's inserted into the what do you call it, the frame, the entrance reducer at the front of the hive, and you put a bottle of sugar water on top of that. So either half a liter or a liter you could probably fit on into that thing. It only lets that colony eat from inside as well, but you can at least see how much they're eating, how much they're utilizing by looking at the bottle, okay, on the outside of the hive. So we feed the bees so that we can stimulate the colony, right? And we want to stimulate the colony into laying more eggs. And the reason why we do that is simply because if we leave it until spring, what's going to end up happening is the normal course of things works this way. Come along with springtime when everything blooms, hopefully. It seems to be a bit late with all this late. It might even be late this year because of the late snow, etc. But let's say it comes along, first of spring comes along, everything starts blooming and all's good. The problem is that if we leave the bees as is, what they're going to do is they're going to utilize that peak flowering period to then increase the hive numbers. Okay, so it takes anywhere from say about 21 to 23 days before you end up having a worker bee emerge. As 18 days. Then they do some orientation flights, then they do cleaning chores, then they do nursing chores, then they do building chores, and only after about 28 days do they actually leave. Since the time that they were laid, do they actually leave the hive and start foraging, right? So the problem with this is if you leave this until the 1st of September, 28 days later, you've kind of missed the peak period of what spring is going to offer, and the bees will be utilizing that period where they should have been completely focused on being able to harvest as much of that peak flowering period as possible. They've kind of had a bit of a, what you call it, a handicap in a way, because instead of having a full workforce of say 40,000 worker bees, okay, that are foraging out in the field every day during that peak period, what we've got now is we've got a staggered workforce that only comes out every day, about anywhere of a range of between 1,800 and 2,000 eggs, or it'll be bees a day that'll be being eggs that'll be laid, and therefore 28 days later you'll have worker foragers leaving the hive doing their foraging from that point onwards. So that delays the entire process. So what we want to do is we want to backtrack, and we want to forward plan for that. And so don't worry if you've missed the 1st of August for this. Anytime now is good. Okay, so it's feeding one-to-one solution of sugar water and what you might call it, sugar and water rather, and and then you're going to end up with I would say feeding between 500 mils and a liter a day, depending on the size of your colony. Another thing you'd want to be doing is while you're busy doing this, try and do this all in one go. Okay, so you're going to especially if you're going to do internal feeding. By the way, another way of doing this before we move on is we spoke about the entrance feeders. We spoke about the internal feeder frames. Another way of doing this is putting an empty super on a box and then putting a container of just dry sugar in there. Okay, so put a container in there, dry sugar. The bees will be able to come to, obviously close it then, put your lid on, but no frames inside that box unless you suspect that the bees are strong enough to be able to start building. You might want to leave 2 or 3 frames on either side of this container, but that is another way of being able to feed your bees. If you don't have an internal feeder frame, if you don't have an entrance feeder or external feeder, you can simply just place a super on top of a brood chamber, leave a couple of the frames on either side of this container, and then fill that container with dry sugar. Okay, not wet, ideally not wet sugar, just in case it spills and everything makes a big mess in the hive. So, and then the bees will come up into the super, the empty super. Obviously, your lid's closed, and they'll eat from that container itself. Okay, and still utilize the sugar being provided. Again, white sugar. Okay, we've got a question from Rory. Is there a way to stop the bees falling into the internal feeder frame? Yes, you can use sponges. Cut up some sponges and let them just float and sit on top of the sugar. What will end up happening, any bees that fall in will be able to get to the sponges and then be able to climb out, hopefully after they dry off and the other bees clean them off. Okay, so great question. Right, where was I? Another reason about feeding, right? Another reason for feeding? No, we covered that. How to feed, we've covered that. What you also might want to do is, we're only talking about stimulating the brood at this stage, which is by getting the queen to lay more. Okay, so we want her to lay like, go from 200 to 300 eggs laying a day to 1,300 to 1,500 to 1,800 eggs a day in over a period of a week. Okay, and then continue that process for at least the next quarter. Obviously, they'll kick over into that. You won't have to feed forever and a day throughout the next quarter. It's just now that you want to be able to feed them to stimulate the brood ahead of the time before the peak flowering period. Okay, that's the main idea here. What I recommend you don't do, and what I would not like for my bees to do, is that I end up feeding them and they end up turning some of that honey into excess. Turning that sugar water into excess sugar honey, if that makes sense, in the hive. Fake honey, false honey, whatever you want to call it. It's basically sugar syrup, sugar honey. That's why I prefer to keep my feeding just to the point where I think it'll help the bees survive. Okay, and only until about the end of August, because then nature takes over, everything starts flowering, and the bees can start doing it themselves. So the other thing you may want to give your bees at this point is a small amount of pollen substitute, because they do need both in order to make brood, okay, and for the health of the hive and to make it through such cold winter. I mean, we've been hit a couple of times now with some serious cold fronts, lots of snow, etc., etc. So poor girls have been battered left, right, and center. So how do we do that? There is a recipe in the Beekeeping in South Africa book, but essentially it's like soy, flour, and a bit of water and a couple of other things. Okay, you can look that up either on our online introduction masterclass. We got the recipe there. You got it in the blue book, or we can look it up online. It's not difficult to make it. To make a small batch, you put a patty. You put basically a patty. It's like a what do you call it? A when you're rolling out dough, for example, very similar to that. And you could again literally just open up the lid while at the same time putting in your sugar, and lay the patty on the frames under the lid. Okay, you can just leave it like that, and they will clean it up. Obviously, put it on a baking paper just on the top of the lid, and they'll eat it up from there. And they don't need a lot. A big sized patty of pollen substitute would be awesome. We've also got pollen bee feed at the shop, so if you're interested in that, you can order a bag from us and just feed them from that. So that's pretty cool. Another question. How are you guys finding this, by the way? Just let me know if you be cool. So only white sugar, Trevor says. Why only? Curious. He's curious. So why only white sugar? Well, because it's more refined, it's got less chance of fermenting, and it's also more easily kind of recognized or absorbed into their system for their biology. I used to many moons ago, right in the beginning, I would be like, yeah, it seems more natural to use brown sugar because that's what it seems. That's my personal choice for my own at the time, when I was still consuming sugar in conjunction with my honey until I started producing enough that because I go through about 5 kilograms of honey a month at this stage, so I don't do any sugar anymore. But that's pretty much the gist of it, is to keep them from getting what do you call it? They can get diarrhea and stuff on the brown sugar as well, so they can get sick. All right, so I hope that's good, Trevor. All right, Marianne. Okay, she's tried dry sugar. Okay, so the bees were not interested in it. If you say give 1-to-1 on a daily basis, how do you know when they will start depositing it in the frames, and do you also stop for a time? Sure, I understand it properly. I currently feed. Okay, she currently feeds 400 to 500 moles of 1-to-1 per week, but not sure if I need to increase. Yeah, if that's per week, it's not a lot, considering that, for example, in order to make about 1 kilogram of beeswax, bees need to process about 8 to 10 kilograms of nectar. So it gives you an idea of what the kind of ratios are there. So I think 400 to 500 moles is probably on the low side, very low side, but it would help them sustain themselves through the cold dearth period. Okay, I would probably do that daily. You could probably be able to do that daily. And yeah, sometimes they don't process the dry food very well, but it is an option. The processed sugar, I should say, it is an option. If you like, I mean, you could again put wet into a container, but you need to make sure that the bees have access to sponges and or marbles or something like that in there, so that they don't fall into the and can't climb out. Okay, because that would be quite dire. Great question. But yeah, 1-to-1's the stimulating formula, and if they're not eating the dry, it might just be. Did you have a queen excluder? Also, just make sure you don't have a queen excluder in between the super and the brood, and allow them to be able to have free access to get through it. That would be my only recommendation there, to be honest, Marianne. So awesome. All right, so if we go on with we've covered the patties, we've covered the sugar water recipe, we've covered the ways you could feed the bees, the methodology, which I think is pretty cool. Other things that you want to do, so that's feeding. And most importantly, while we're doing this, is again, just to recap, is that we more or less need 28 days of brood management, if you call it that, and stimulation, in order to take advantage of the full peak of the spring and summer flowering. Okay, so we've got 28 days. You've got to work backwards. That's when you start seeing like massive growth and daily staggered amounts of workers that will be able to emerge from the hive, that are actually workers and foragers, not just workers, but they're actually foragers. Remember, it's 28 days, give or take a day or two, before they actually do that. So, and you want to be able to take the most advantage of whatever's flowering in your area, knowing that you have, let's say, 40 to 60,000 bees versus 10 to 15,000 bees, being able to do that with only, say, 500 new workers coming onto into the workforce every day, if you don't feed your bees at the moment. All right, so if we move on, any other questions on the feeding stuff? Put your hands up, guys, or slot it in the chat. Okay. What else should we be doing now during prepping for bee season? Okay, so we've just been through a winter dearth period. We're still kind of in there at the end of this. what's happened is that inside the colony is that because of the dearth period, because of the cold, because of lack of resources, and because also because of the management of resources, the colony has contracted. It's gone from like 40,000, between 40,000, 60,000, 80,000 bees, depending on the size of your bees and your hive and so on and so forth. They've contracted by probably about 60%. Okay. So bees live anywhere between 35 and about 40 days, depending. Drones could live up to 3 months. You may have experienced that drones were being expelled from your colonies. And if that's the case, that's because the queen and the hive has decided that resources are limited. So they expel, they kick the poor oaks out. The drones get kicked out, and that's it. They don't get let back into the hive. Okay, so they've got to go fend for themselves. It pretty much means that they're goners, right? And one of the reasons why they do this is simply because of a matter of resource management. So the bees have contracted a major amount down to say 40% of what they were during the peak period in the summer season, in the on season. And so now we've got to get them back to that point. But having said that, because you should have had a really good season, honey producing season during the year. What may have happened is that over this period now, a lot of the honey either has been moved into the brood, or you have a locked honey brood frames. Okay, now, what I mean by locked honey brood frames is that the bees either moved honey down into the brood chamber in order to have it closer to where they are and to conserve energy between feeding in the super and coming back down and then backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. So they may have moved a whole bunch of the honey nectar down into the brood, and now there's no space for laying. So, or there could be, if you have an established colony that's older than say a season, what you want to be doing in either case, what you want to be doing is while you're opening up your boxes to feed them, and don't do this when there's a cold front, by the way. Okay, so you don't do this when there's a cold front, because opening the colony at this stage is going to, especially with this cold front that's now on with the snow and stuff. Obviously, if you're in a subtropical area, that's not an issue. But any cold air and exposure to the colony could damage and be detrimental to any larvae and eggs that are currently in the hive. Okay, especially if you're going to do that for more than 10 minutes. Anyway, so open up the box. What you want to be looking for inside the brood chamber only is any dark frames, comb with dark with a dark color, either dark brown or even potentially black wax and comb, and honey laden comb. Okay, that's in the brood. And the idea is, I wouldn't necessarily take that out right now because we've still got a cold front at this point. But you want to know which colonies have that in their brood chamber. And when this cold front moves off, you want to be back into that colony. You're going to be feeding them a little bit again, or topping them up with some sugar water, etc., and maybe another patty. And when you do that, and it's warmer, you're going to take those frames out, and you're going to remove all the comb, including the honey, ideally, because that you can either use yourself or potentially feed back to the bees if you like. But that comb now you can use for two things. You can make candles out of it. You can make three things. Candles out of it, wax your own flat wax foundation sheets if you melt it, and or strips. And you could also make your own bee lure or swarm lure out of that wax. Okay, obviously you must take the honey out of it. Okay, whatever you do, extract the honey out of it, squeeze it, crush it, eat it. It's up to you, But take the comb off the frame from underneath the first wire. So anywhere from underneath the first wire, if you cut along that in a Langstroth brood frame, what will end up happening is you still have that strip, that little strippy of comb, which will effectively form a starter strip for them to build the new comb onto, okay, over the next few weeks. So that saves you, the need to replace the entire comb. Although feel free if you want to do that. We do sell the wax foundation sheets, brood foundation sheets at the shop. But if you only were looking at using a starter strip in there, you don't have to do that because you've left that little bit of old one at the top there. Okay. You need to take at least 1 to 2 frames out of your brood chamber when you're doing brood maintenance or maintenance for the for the brood during the end of the winter. And the reason being is that, again, it allows new brood space for the queen to lay. So remember, we're wanting her to be able to lay anywhere up to 2,000 eggs a day. But she needs the space to be able to do that, okay? And that's why we need to make sure that the brood frames are inspected and checked, and you are refreshing them on usually 1 to 2 times a year. Okay, once or twice a year, you could do that, but especially at this point in time. And then you also would want to do, it's usually the frames in the middle of the hive. So you take the 5th frame or the 6th frame, counting from either side, have a look at those, double check, you take them out, move the ones from the side back in again, cut off the top, cut off the comb, leaving that much from the top or down to the front, the first wire. If you've got Langstroths, if you've got KTBs, Kenyan top bar hives, then you just leave that bit at the top. Okay, you're not going to have wires necessarily in your frames, but that's fine. So leave that top a little bit, put those either 1 or 2 frames back, but at frame 1 and frame 10 on the outside of the brood chamber. And that way you still keep the core of the frames more or less in order, and you keep the core of the hive and the structure of the hive more or less in play as well, in place still. Okay, we've got another question from Rory. What do you do if a large brood filled frame is honey bound? Will the central frames not normally have the most brood? Obviously, you're not going to, so good question there, Rory. You're not going to remove anything that has brood on it, okay? The idea is that you want to have, these frames are meant to be honey bound, honey locked, and less than, I'd say, 20% brood on them. If they do have brood, if you have the brood and you want to wait for them to emerge, that's also fine. But just consider that while those frames are honey bound or honey locked, the queen's going to have a lot less space to lay in. So it's kind of a bit of a, you're going to have to weigh up the pros and cons there for yourself. But if there's less than 20% of the brood on that frame, I would probably remove it, to be honest with you, and just replace it, or either replace it with a new wax sheet or a new wax strip, or, as I say, cut the comb out and then leave that little bit under the first wire, from above the first wire rather. So that's covered that one. All right, so also what you need to be doing, guys, and feel free to ask more questions as we go along, because I feel like I sound like I'm one of those guys at the horse racing, like wada. Anyway, it's like an information dump here. So hold on to your seats. Anyway, brood management. Okay, so brood maintenance, brood management. So we know that you've got to remove 1 to 2 frames. Make sure that's honey lock frames, less than 20% brood on there. Take them out. Okay, replace it. But you're looking for brown, dark brown to black kind of frames. If they're sort of quite light, super light, still beach sand light, you're probably still okay for another season, or at least for the next few months. But then what I would do is I would consider looking back again in about a month's time, and just review the situation. Okay, so that's brood maintenance. Ooh, when do you do a split? Good question, Andrew. So that's a little bit ahead of us, I think, at this stage, although if one is not careful, if the bees don't have enough brood space, this is the catch, and this is why it's very important to do this brood maintenance. Okay, if the bees don't have enough space to while we're stimulating the brood to lay eggs, then what can happen is exactly that. The bees can split, and you have half the colony trekking off, and they become somebody else's free tracking swarm. Okay. Alternatively, if you're using our swap, what I call our swap lure, which is our swarm wipe or sachet lure, that we distribute as for at the shop. This stuff's been university tested, okay, in a field study where if you're using one of these sachets within 50 meters of your existing apiary, now remember this is an existing apiary. So in other words, you've got more than say 2 hives in this space, and the one colony has a split or absconsion, okay, if you've got another catch box that's empty within 50 meters radius of that parent colony with one of these wipes in it, one of these sachets in there, it's like a wet wipe, but it's got special hormones and stuff on it, chemicals on it, that has been field tested by a university with 90% accuracy that it will draw and lure and bait that absconding and tracking colony or splitting colony to that box, to where that sachet is. Okay, that's not using lemongrass. I can't say the same for lemongrass. We haven't field tested that, but lemongrass could have the same effect, or up to a certain amount of the same effect or similar effect. But I know for a fact that the swarm lure wipes are 90% successful in that particular instance. If you're using, so I'll get back to your question in a sec, but if you're using lemongrass to catch bees at the moment, then, or rather, if you're using before we move on to lemongrass, if we're using the swarm lure sachets, okay, then not for absconding or splitting colonies that are leaving your parent apiary right now, but you are wanting to lure or bait outside colonies that are tracking past, okay, then the success rate with that, obviously bees need to be in the area wanting to do this, okay, it's not like they just suddenly appear from the multiverse or the beeverse, okay, suddenly they arrive. They need to be in the area, and they need to be tracking past through the area within, say, a kilometer of your apiary, or wherever you rather have put your catch boxes with the swarm lure in. And I know that we get about a 70% strike rate on non-parent based tracking swarms within a 50-meter radius, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if I'm making sense there, but this is outside or external non-parental based splitting or absconsion colonies, okay? So lemongrass will probably have about a similar effect as well. Lemongrass, a little bit of, if you've got the beeswax from your brood maintenance, then you can mix the two of those a little bit together, melt the beeswax after you've taken the honey out, melt the beeswax, add about 10 drops of lemongrass that you can get from us at the shop, hunky-dory, and then you go and paint that back when it's still quite melted. Paint that on the inside of your boxes at the back, not at the front of the entrance, at the back of the hive, or on the frame, at the bottom of a frame. Paint a little bit of that, and then you go place that at least 1 meter above ground, okay, ideally. So let me get back to a question, which was about splitting. Go back there. Where do you do a split? So I would not do a split now. The bees have to recover. There's not enough bees at the moment to do a split, in my opinion. But if you've been feeding your bees, come sort of the 1st or 2nd week of September, when you're going to have a massive amount of workforce and you're going to have larvae to work with, then you could look at doing a split, okay? But you're going to have to continue the feeding process throughout that period. So just bear that in mind. And generally speaking, you're not going to have that much honey then to harvest from either one of these, either the donating colony or the emerging colony or the new colony. Okay, neither one of them are going to likely be able to produce honey in this first season. Okay, unless you have something phenomenal like access to sunflower, access to the top end of the blue gum species. So we're looking at red river gum, forest gum, ironbark. Aloe Daviana is finished now, so that's not going to be an option. But the idea is to have 4 and 4 rating on both pollen and nectar. Then you could look at probably having still getting a harvest, okay, out of the batch. But I would only do that, Andrew, in September. Okay, after the bees have really gotten some vuma behind them. Okay, they need eggs. And they need food, and they need warmer climate. Otherwise, they're going to suffer, man. They're not going to make it during this cold period. Yeah. Okay. Right. Mark de Klerk. Would it not be better to move the central frames outwards and place the new frames in the middle? Look, dude, give it a try. You can do that too. What can end up happening is that those 2 frames can get locked in as well. Okay. So in my opinion, I have done both. I've just simply put the frames back into where they were before. I've also done the situation which I've explained earlier on. I prefer, at the moment, I think I'm preferring the situation where I move the new ones to the outside. Okay, give it a go, man. See how it goes for you. Okay. How do you know, Alan? How do you know when to put another super on? Well, currently you shouldn't have any supers on unless you're using the super feeding method I explained earlier on, Alan. Simply because the supers are likely to be empty and there are extra space for the bees to try and keep warm at this stage. So usually what normally would happen is that at the end of the summer period, early winter, unless you are absolutely sure you're going to have a winter harvest for your bees, I move my supers off. I remove the supers completely and I pack them, I clean them, I pack them away, wrap them with black plastic bags, put a mothball in one, and that way the wax moth doesn't get in there, and neither do the ants, and I'll store them. Okay. If you've got multiple hives or big apiary or whatever the case is, then you stack your supers on top of each other, put a mothball in the bottom one, and make sure that they seal properly. Okay, so that wax moth can't get in there and the ants aren't likely to get in there either. Make sure they're kept in a dry, sort of dark space and out of the sun. And ideally where other bees will not be able to smell them and be able to get access to them, because that could cause a problem, especially during the winter when on warmish days, those supers are going to smell like a buffet, okay, to any dearth, to any colony in the area, including yours, where I am now having a dearth period. They can smell the wax and some of the honey, and then they're going to think that there's a massive amount of food in there, and they're going to hunt for that. They're going to head straight for that. Okay, so when you do, but to answer your question, so right now you should be feeding your bees, waiting for the spring to come, and then I would usually put my supers on. If your bees are anywhere near Aloe Daviana at the moment, you should be having supers on your boxes at the moment anyway in the Highveld area. And if you're anywhere else, if you've been on my newsletter, which is available for free, the subscription is www.beware.co.za/subscribe. Then you would have seen the latest newsletter where I listed about 15 flowering trees, plants, weeds, shrubs, crops at the moment that you could be focusing on. And if you are anywhere in those areas at the moment, just pay attention to when you inspect your colonies. Again, I wouldn't necessarily put a super on right now with this snow front at the moment, this cold front in the South African area. But if you are anywhere near any of those plants that are registered, especially the P4s and N4, so that's pollen 4, nectar 4 category flowering bee plants right now from my newsletter, then you should have a super on. How do you know when to put another one on? Well, usually what I would do is that when I'm doing an inspection, lift up the frames. If I see the frames are, especially if they're brand new if they were new frames, I'd want them to be 80% covered with comb, with wax comb, not really full yet, but 80% covered with comb. I put a new super on. Okay, they don't necessarily have to be full of honey or capped. The reason I say that is because there was for many a moons a big debate about when do we, my super frames don't ever seem to be capped, and I'm like, what's going on with that? So there was always this debate about, well, are the bees, do they actually have enough honey? Are they connecting enough nectar, or they don't have enough nectar? That's why they're uncapping them. And it turns out what ends up happening is if you don't provide the bees, obviously, if you don't provide the bees with enough space, then what will end up happening is they'll just leave the cap open during a nectar flow. They don't cap it until the nectar flow is over. So you've got to put another super on at that point. And how to tell is if they've built out pretty much 80% of the comb on most of the frames. I'd say 8 out of just 10 frames in your super, put on another super. Here's the caveat. If you're anywhere near Capensis in a Highveld area or in a Scutellata area, then technically speaking at this stage, there's also a bit of there's also been this talk about being able to manage, or having to, that there's good practice if you manage the Capensis problem getting into your colonies and far away from the Scutellata queen, and to kind of manage this is to prevent, or to rather limit the use of a high number of supers. So more than 3 supers on a box, even more than 2 actually would probably be recommended. But hopefully that answers your question on that. Cool question. All right, let's have a look. Marion's got another one. Some beekeepers also remove drone cells from brood frames. Is it a good thing during spring maintenance or not? Yeah, that's a great question as well. I believe, you know, it's an interesting thing, because it's a great sign if the colony is producing drones at the moment. It can mean that particular colony is suffering. The queen is old and is going to be replaced, and naturally then the instinct is for them to create more drones in case there's a failure in the queen, in a new queen or replacement of a queen. Therefore, at the very least, the genetics will be passed on to other colonies in the area by those same drones of this dying out queen. Okay, so pay very careful attention if your bees are producing drones at this point in time. Just double check that there are other eggs around as well, and not just drones. Also pay attention and be quite careful when handling your brood frames in this instance, simply because if the situation is such that there's a super seizure queen, in other words, a new queen is replacing the old queen that's now has a low fertility or whatever, the cell could be lodged between or adjoining between frames. Now, this has happened to me a couple of times. This is why I'm mentioning this. In all the times I've made queens and split queens and all this sort of stuff, is that the queen cells can be adjoining or joined between frames in the brood. And then as you're doing an inspection, you lift up the frame, and then now you have a broken queen cell. Okay, and that was the only one in that colony, because why? They were replacing the old one. So just be a little bit cognitive of that, be aware of that if you're looking through your colonies. But yes, in short, just double check that your queen is present, that there are other eggs besides the drones, or that there is no super seizure cell. Now, usually there's only one. If you see more than one, then it's very likely that that colony is about to split anyway. Now, what do you do with those queen cells? Well, traditionally, a lot of old toppies used to say, they just toss them. They keep one and they destroy the others. I'm like, no, man, that's not economic to me. It's not efficient to me. I would harvest those extra ones and have spare catch boxes, and then start moving those into other boxes. Okay, but this is a little bit more advanced for this particular Zoom. So if you want more information on that, you come on our courses. We've got one on the 4th of September, and we've got the practical intermediate course later on in September, and so on. So spring maintenance, I would probably remove them. In short, I would remove the drones, unless I was going to be doing some queen breeding or queen rearing, and I wanted the drones for mating. Okay. Sigri, welcome, Sigri. I'm a passive beekeeper, attempted to do brood maintenance the first time. I've had the hive for 5 years. Oh, okay, that's way too long. Okay, totally stuck. They've been propolized. Okay, so they completely propolized in place, because 5 years is 5 years too long. Okay, it's all right. So essentially what you're going to have to do is get your hive tool, and you're going to have to break all the propolis seals on the edge of the hive, all the way along either end of the hives where the frame sits, the frame shoulders are, and then between the frame shoulders, you're going to have to break the propolis there as well. Whether or not they've actually joined the actual frames is another, I can't tell at this point. You'd have to have a look at that. but essentially it's really the only way that you can able to do this. Alternatively, buy a bunch of new frames. I'm assuming you've got a 10 frame or 9 to 10 frame Langstroth hive present. This is a little bit drastic. I wouldn't do it now during this cold front at this point in time. But you could get another set of 10 frames with wax foundation sheets on them or strips on them at the very least. Wait until it's warmer again, and then you could place totally replace. Take the as much as you can get them out. Take all of those brood frames out, put the new frames in, and get the bees. Shake the bees off into that bottom box. Okay, so you're going to have brand new frames at the bottom. What you could do is then also take a second brood chamber and put that, or you could reverse this around. You could get a second brood chamber with 10 frames in it, and just put that one on top of the old one. And what'll end up happening is that the bees will climb up and start establishing in the new house. Okay, and those frames you can manage and manipulate and do what you need to do with them. All right, that would probably be my what you might call it. That would be my primary advice to you. But if you can get your hive tool between all the shoulders and all the ends, that's the only way that you can kind of prime them out. But if the wax comb is joined, that's going to be a real mess. You're going to have to try and break each of those frames and combs away from each other. Yeah, come on one of our courses. We'll show you how to do that. It's a bit better if you could come and see it on one of our courses. Okay, good luck. Maybe get hold of a beekeeper in your area to come and help you if you're far away from us in Midrand. Trevor again, for long do the swarm lures last? How long do they last? And work for any catch box? Oh, good question. Okay, so they do dry out over time, but a bee's sense of smell is about 6 times stronger than a dog's. So, and a dog is super strong. Okay, so bees have even been sensitized, like dogs that can smell, chemicals like coffee and drugs and whatever the case is. Bees have been sensitized to do exactly the same by NASA and one of the universities in the States, where they've actually been able to figure out, they've been able to sensitize bees to smell the triggering chemical in landmines. Okay, and then those bees were then trained. They had handlers sent over to Mozambique and I think it was Mozambique and Angola, where they were able to actually clear landmine fields using bees instead of dogs, because obviously the dogs are at risk and so are the handlers. In this case, obviously some beekeepers could be the beekeeping handler could be the bee handler rather could be at risk. But what they literally do is they place the hive rather in a field, and then they have a certain cameras placed around in safe spots within an area, and they track the flight of the bees. And what ends up happening is that they can actually see that wherever the bees are flying over the most in an area, it makes hotspots like a heat map, and that's exactly where the landmines would be. It's phenomenal. Anyway, getting back to the thing, I would say they last about 10 to 14 days. Okay, effectively 10 to 14 days. All right, more than enough time for a colony a chicken colony to move in. Let's just see what else we've got here. Is the way. Hang on, I think I missed one. Okay, yeah. So Morion, when is the latest in the season to do a split? The latest in the season. All right. Well, you want it's not really a question for at this present time, but essentially you would still want the bees to have enough food to survive, or you're going to have to feed them. So there is no time that you can't really do a split, aside from, I'd say, now in this last dearth period. Okay, just because it takes a lot of resources for the bees. So I'd say anywhere between September through to May, probably. But be prepared if you're going to do this sort of thing in May that that you're going to have to feed the bees. Okay. Who's asking there about Okay, when adding a super, do you add it at the top or the bottom? I usually just add them at the top. I used to add them to the top, but I've thought about this. I've also thought about this a little bit differently in that I think it's worthwhile actually testing. I used to add them to the top for years and years and years. And most recently, I've been thinking about this. The bees have to travel all the way from the entrance of the hive, all the way up through the brood box, through the first super, presuming that you've got a level 1 super in there, to the second level of super before transfer of the nectar can now take place into the colony. So into that super, into the cell. Okay. So in hindsight, I'm kind of thinking, well, maybe there's an opportunity there to look at this. Somebody can test this out and rather put the new super straight on top of the brood, straight on top of the brood chamber, and below, in between the old super and the brood chamber, so the worker bees don't have to go as far anymore. So that is consideration number one. Consideration number two is that you are disturbing the internal dynamics then of the hive itself by doing that. So it may cause unconsidered side effects at this point. But yeah, I've been thinking about that recently, because just in terms of resources, it may well be better for the bees to have, but whether it's actually going to be practically better for them is another question. Cool. All right, so another thing that's important, right? We've been talking a lot about the internal status of the hive and the colony itself. Another thing that's vitally important, right, is going to be you, your preparations for yourself. Okay. So what I mean by this, well, if you packed away your bee kit during the winter period, you haven't really used it much. Excuse me, especially if it's been in storage or whatever the case is. Now's the time, if you haven't been using it since the end of summer, whip it out, and you need to do a full inspection of your bee suit or your bee overall, whatever you're using, and check that no damage or any mice or rats have gotten into those, into your gloves, same thing. And the same thing with your smoker, with the what's the name of the smoker, the bellow of the smoker. Okay, because unfortunately, for whatever reason, rats and mice tend to like the overalls, and they like the gloves, and they like the bellows. Usually, probably because they denim or cotton and leather based type stuff. So if they get in there, they chew it, and then you go out to the field for the first time, haven't checked your stuff out, and then lo and behold, you've got finger holes, or you've got a patch in your suit that you haven't noticed, and the bees can get in there and sting you. Okay. The same thing with your bellow, just to double check, and then give everything a good clean, guys. Especially with things like American foul brood, and also just for good hygiene practice, you want to clean your hive tool, you want to clean your gloves. You can sterilize. Obviously, leather gloves are a bit more difficult to do than PVC gloves. That's why I lean more towards PVC gloves. They're much easier to clean, although they may be less easier to. You have less dexterity in your fingers and control with your fingers. I only generally use leather gloves when I'm working with a queen, where I want to have fine dexterity, fine use of my fingers and stuff like that. So I've seldomly used it when I'm harvesting honey, so therefore they don't need that much cleaning per se. But a good wipe with some antiviral, antifungal type of cloth or wipe, or whatever case, is just good enough on those. And then your PVCs, you can dip those in bleach, mixture of bleach and water together. Let them soak for 30 seconds or something in there. Same thing with your hive tool. And then also give your the metal parts of your smoker a wash as well, or a wipe. Okay, just because you don't get the leather bellow stuff wet. Okay, that'll damage it. And then once that's all done, you're all good. If there are any repairs, do those and get those covered. If you need to replace stuff, we've got spare bellows at the shop. You can order those. I've put a link into the chat thing for our shop. if you didn't already know. Intention, nudge, nudge. So yeah. Oh, something else that's interesting, right, is a lot of times we get asked this question about, so what else should we be doing for bee season? So guys, planting. We were going to be talking about planting tonight, and see, we're getting close to the time where we're going to end the Zoom. We're running out of time. So planting your seeds. What can we be planting? What could we be planting for bees in a local area, in a household gardening area, even on small holdings, especially in homesteads? Okay, so a number of cool things that are edible is going to be like your borage. Okay, borage is cool. Sweet basil, African basil, all edible and awesome for the bees. Sunflowers, really good, fast growing. Again, edible and awesome for bees. Ideally, though, you don't want to have a GMO. You don't want to have a GMO seed in any one of these, okay? Because some of them have got now built-in pesticides and insecticides in the actual plant itself, which comes out, exudes itself in the pollen and the nectar, okay? So where possible, get an heirloom seed supplier, which means that they are still organic or non-genetically modified, okay? So borage, lavender is a good one, rosemary is a good one, sweet basil, African basil, what was the other one I said? Sunflowers, also awesome. And then if you're looking at things like crops that you want to grow, although they're not going to necessarily flower now, this season, anything that's, so avocados, exceptionally good. They are dependent, 80% dependent, okay, on honeybee pollination. So, and not only that, when honeybees are used to pollinate avos, the production of that tree per tree, okay, the fruit goes from about a 50 kilogram production or yield up to 300 kilogram. 150 kilogram. That's a 300% increase. Okay, 150 kilograms can be produced or yielded off a single avo tree if you use honeybees to pollinate that orchard. Okay, so it gives you an example of what you can do, what difference it can have if you're planting really cool bee-friendly plants that are also edible by us, by humans, and or other animals on your homestead, and everybody wins. Biodiversity grows, all the other pollinators are going to come by, which means more birds are going to come by, which means other insects are going to come by, hopefully the good ones and not just the bad ones per se. But if there are more birds in the area, that means that they're going to be more likely to take care of any bad insects as well, which is pretty cool. So the biodiversity of everything develops and grows. Yeah, so I can't really tell you guys much more in terms of actual soil preparation. Unfortunately, that was going to be Tanya's side of the topic for tonight, so I've had to take up the time basically and make up for that all in one. She's just not feeling too well this evening. But yeah, who else is growing stuff for bees and planting seeds at the moment as far as edible stuff's going? Anybody planting some cool stuff at the moment? Anybody else got any questions? Something else. Okay, so in closing, I was going to say something else that you guys can practice right now is, if you don't have, a lot of times people make the assumption, or they're under the impression that you have to own a big piece of land to keep bees. And that's a misnomer. Okay, it's not true. If you want to keep them on your own property, then yeah, you need to, there are bylaws, and every city is different, what bylaws they have and what they say about bees in those bylaws. I go by the number of what the Johannesburg Metropolitan says is about 25 meters from any animal dwelling or human dwelling, okay? 5 meters from a boundary wall or fence, within 5 meters of access to water, which is ridiculous because bees can fly about 3 kilometers away if need be. They usually don't go more than 1.5 kilometers anyway. for efficiency purposes, but also further than not within. Sorry, let me try that again. So not within 5 meters of any compost. Okay. So those are the Johannesburg bylaws in South Africa. But the beauty about beekeeping, guys, is that you don't have to own the land that the bees are kept on. Okay, so you do need to be aware of, security and access, that kind of stuff. And then also pests, which are not necessarily hive pests, but actually things like badgers and baboons can also be pests. All right. I've also had I've had 1 or 2 hives pushed over by hippos at the Crocodile River before. Bit of a problematic pest to deal with, a hippo. And but I think you get the point. So what I'm trying to say is utilize this time now to spot apiary sites, talk to friends, talk to people, talk to farmers, pick up the phone around, find out who's got, because the next stuff that's going to be flowering in my next email, I'm going to be sending you guys, everybody out in the next email are going to be things like citrus, lychees, macadamians are coming on, and they flower twice a year. In fact, Sabio has actually got doing, I think they're doing presentations with the macadamian farmers or something like that at the moment, which is pretty cool. And bees are specifically, they can benefit with bee pollination. They can benefit macadamian growers by about 10 to 15%. That's nuts per tree, so it's pretty significant, although not nearly as significant as avos, which is up to 300%, which is pretty cool. But for example, I'll give you an idea. Sunflower, anybody that that's growing sunflowers, obviously there's two major issues that you have. 3, theft is one, theft and vandalism is one. The second one is when the farmer is going to spray, not if the farmer is going to spray, it's when the farmer is going to spray pesticides and insecticides, because they've probably been taught or told or educated by a salesperson and an agent that the pesticides are bee friendly. There's no such thing as a bee friendly pesticide. And not only is it bad for the bees, but it's also going to then end up in any honey that you take off of that colony. Okay, so you do need to be, whenever you are moving your bees to an apiary, make sure that if there is going to be any spraying, that the farmer notifies you at least 2 to 3 days before, and if that's enough time for you to be able to make a plan to move your hives off the property and leave them off the property for at least a week. Okay, so ideally you want to be looking for farmers that are organically farming. Okay, apiary sites that have organic farming practices, and or you're looking for sites that are not necessarily commercial crops. So by that I mean you could be looking at places that are growing things like lavender, things that are growing. Again, are they going to be spraying? It could be onions. Onion pollination is really important. Not going to get very nice honey off of that. But canola or rapeseed, exceptionally cool at this point in time. At the moment, if you can get that honey is quite nice. It does granulate really quickly, but you get really super honey off of that. And then all the wild indigenous stuff, the stuff that was in my newsletter a couple of weeks back, the indigenous stuff would be awesome. Again, the problem with that is that the number of hives that you're going to put down within an area is limited, because there's a limit, a lot of the indigenous stuff is just going to be scattered and sparse. But you can get hold of things like eucalyptus. So where there's red ironbark, black ironbark, gray ironbark, any one of those, red river gum, any one of those, if there's a plantation or a couple of hectares of that in a spot, whenever that stuff starts flowering, not all blue gums and eucalyptus are created equal, by the way. This is why I email on my list. When I email them out, I'll give you guys the pollen and the nectar ratios, their ratings. Okay, and I'm going to be doing this on YouTube soon as well. So look out for that on the YouTube channel, YouTube/Beware Online. Find sites that have 3s and 4 ratings for pollen and nectar, ideally pollen and nectar, or nectar at least with a 2 of pollen, because the bees need both for their diet. Okay, And if you're going to something like a eucalyptus forest, or whatever you want to call it, thicket, then the chances are that nobody's going to be spraying anything on those. But you do want to be aware of what's going around in the area, because bees most likely aren't going to just then go to the blue gums if there's a sunflower field like 500 meters away. Okay, and the spray, unfortunately, the pesticides will drift and they'll probably get onto the flowers of the blue gums anyway. So just be careful of transference. Okay, wherever you put your sites, bees down on sites, and then be prepared for things like badger protection, baboon protection, that kind of thing. So for badgers, you want your hives at least 1.5 meters above ground, and usually it makes it much more practical if the hives are on single poles rather than having them on multiple poles. What we used to do, and what I still do in Nelspruit, is we have a single pole, but we have a pallet, and on that pallet we get 4 hives. So that's pretty cool. They're 1.5, 1.6 meters above ground, and so at least I get 4 every pole. But I also have to be careful of overhead, what do you call it, walkways for the badgers, because they're smart. They're really smart. Check up Stoffel. You can just see how creative they are. So just make sure that there's no branches that he can climb along, and the baboons the same thing, climb along and get down onto that platform. Then it's, regardless of what you've done putting it on a pole, you're going to get to them. And I think that's probably a wrap. Once a swarm is caught in a catch box, when do you know when to transfer them into a brew box? Mark, good question. Love it. Yeah. So that's the other thing you should be doing right now, right? Actually, before we close off, is you should be baiting your catch boxes now. Okay. Putting out catch boxes with swarm lure, lemongrass, the swarm lure sachets, and putting them out into fields where the bees are already foraging, and you're likely to attract tracking swarms into those catch boxes. Now, Mark's question alludes to the fact of having done that, you want to place the catch boxes at least 1 meter above ground as well, and ideally facing northeast, with the bait that we've been talking about tonight. And then once they have moved in, ideally you want to leave them in there until they've at least built out 4 frames. Okay, and then you would transfer them over into a brew box. They could have even already have started still on the 5th frame. If you've got a 5 or 6 frame box, leave them to do the 5th frame, even start off the 5th frame, then you transfer them out, and then recycle or repurpose that catch box, put it back into the field somewhere, either the same spot or a different spot, and rinse and repeat. Okay, so that's a great question. Once they get to 4 or 5 frames in a 5 or 6 frame catch box. All right. Next question. What was the next question? I think that's it. Awesome, guys. So yeah, pansies are also another one, actually, if you want to grow. Sweet peas are pretty cool. Let me think of a few others. Yeah, bees like the onions. They like, what's that other one? Lucerne would be a good one as well at the moment, but obviously we can't eat lucerne, but animals on your homesteads would be able to eat the lucerne. So that's pretty cool. All right, guys, any other questions before we close? This is your chance. You can open up your mic if you want to ask me a question directly, instead of putting in the chat. Put your video and your mic on, and let's have a quick 5-minute frequent asked questions. Anything else? Next course, Mark. Yeah, cool. Our next beginners course is the 4th of September. That takes place in Midrand. Come and join us if you want to come on that. We do hire out the bee suits if you don't already have one, if you just want to check stuff out. Also, we do have a starter pack that ranges, I think, from about 4,800 to, depending on the size of your bee suit, upwards by about a couple of $100 as the sizes move up. And that includes 2 beehives, full complete hives, and bee suit, smoker, hive tool, bee brush, and a couple of other things, gloves. And yeah, I think we're done. You guys, welcome. Jeff, thanks for joining us. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Alan. Great questions. Marianne, lucky to see you, regular guys, again on with us. Sorry, Tanya couldn't make it tonight, guys, and she did pass on her regards to everybody, and just hopes you will join us on the next one, which will now not be next Wednesday because we skipped that one. It's the last one of the business month, so it'll be probably in the first week of September. Awesome. Who's that? Siggy, yeah, you're welcome. And Trevor, thanks for joining us. Great, guys. Jeff, Amy. Amy's got a question, does she? Yes, no. I think that's it, guys. Cool, man. So, yeah, get onto our YouTube channel. I'm starting to make quite a lot of different different videos on there for you guys to follow through as well. Obviously, this recording will go on there over the next couple of days, probably by Sunday at the latest, and you can check it on there as well. Okay, guys, feel free to pop over and see the previous post that I did on there as well. It's a shorter version of this one. And but yeah, cool, guys. Nice to have you guys on board, and we look forward to seeing you guys at the next one. And yeah, join us on the next bee course if you're interested. Thanks, Tanya, Trevor, and all the best, guys. Take care and best beekeeping. All right. Ciao, guys.